The book of Joshua is about taking territory. It has obvious literal meanings for its time, but also many spiritual parallels for ours. See, God has called each of us to enter into His promise, receive an inheritance as co-heirs with His Son, and help shape His kingdom by working for Him and allowing Him to work through us. Now, along the way, we will need to be strong and courageous. We would need to adhere to God's ways, avoid compromise and unhealthy alliances, and persevere, especially through the trials and the long battles. We see all of these lessons in the historical parable of the conquest of Canaan. Now, it's a template for how we are to enter God's promises. It's significant then that the book begins with God Himself repeatedly encouraging Joshua to be strong and courageous, and to immerse himself in God's Word. These are vital keys to living a kingdom lifestyle. Other keys would follow. We start off with a time of consecration, and yet this generation of Israelites had not been circumcised. A strange encounter with God's presence, where an angel himself identifies as the commander of God's armies. A hard lesson in obedience when one man keeps some of the Jericho's plunder for himself and causes the entire nation to lose in the next battle. And then there's a hard lesson in the compromise of the leaders when they are duped into a treaty with the locals that limits their choices in the future, and so on. See, by following God's instructions, the people are able to put their past behind them and press on into the promise, however, with stumbling at times. Now, their conquest is decisive, and though not always thorough, many of the Canaanites remain in the land at the time of when this book ends. And God fights on behalf of His people when they trust and they depend on Him. So even altering some of the physical laws by extending a day. Now He will fulfill His plans on behalf of those who would believe, and the theme is reinforced in the portrayal of several characters who demonstrate great faith. Aside from Joshua himself, the first is a prostitute named Rahab, a resident of Jericho who is put in the position of choosing sides. And when Joshua sends 2 spies to scout the land, the same number that came back with the good report 40 years earlier, Rahab becomes their key contact, hiding them and helping them to strategize in exchange for her life and the lives of her family members. Now, when Israel conquers Jericho, Rahab, her life is preserved and she is honored for her assistance. And centuries later, we will find that her name appears in the genealogy of the Messiah. Another great faith figure is Caleb, one of the 2 surviving spies from the previous generation. The other is Joshua, of course. Now, despite his firm belief that God would overcome the giants and give His people the land He had promised, Caleb spends 40 years suffering the same consequences of the people in rebellion. Now, in his 80s, he is still full of life and vigor and zealous to receive his piece of promise that God had preserved Caleb's life and has rewarded his faith. Now, interwoven with the accounts of these 2 prominent characters are the stories of the parted waters and generally steady conquest, which continues throughout the book. God waits that the Jordan waters are at the flood stage before parting the river for His people to pass through, a revealing illustration of how He steps into our problems when the obstacles are greatest. See, the famous story of the Battle of Jericho shows us that there is no obstacle too great for God, nor any method too strange. The varied approach to each battle show us that while God's character never changes, His methods very frequently do, and evidence that we can never just follow simply by understanding His principles, but only by having a direct relationship with Him. So God's instruction to establish cities of refuge throughout the land are an early example of how His justice and His compassion meet. They are penalties for wrongdoing, as well as protection for suspected wrongdoers. Now, there is a reason God has called his people to separate, to live in a separate land. He is in the process of revealing his nature to them through the events in their lives. And the book ends with warning that being chosen doesn't mean immunity from God's chastisement, and with a challenge for the people to make a decision to serve God alone. And Joshua and his household make that decision, and the people join in, that they will declare their undying alliances and allegiances to the Lord in the land that he had given them. Their future will be determined by how well they maintain their devotion to their king.